Okay, so here goes nothing. We're going to start our lesson for day 70, which is the first lesson that should have happened right after spring break. And it's going to involve solving quadratics by factoring. So if you haven't watched the review video that I made for reviewing our factoring methods, you need to do that first. You are not going to be successful at what we're doing if you cannot factor. So please go back and watch that video. Everything that we're going to do today is based off this idea of the zero product property. So what the zero product property says is if the product of two factors equals 0, then one or both of the factors must equal 0. And this should make sense because what it really is saying is that if I have two things and I multiply them to get 0, one of them has to be 0, or they both could be. Because 0 times 0 is 0, as is anything times 0 is equal to 0. So if we know that they're product, that means when we multiply them together, if we multiply two things together to get 0, one of them has to be 0. And that's what we use to solve these equations by factoring. So the notes for day 70 really are more examples than they are notes, so you don't have to write down a bunch of words, but you do need to write down the problem. So we start out nice and easy where the quadratic's already been factored for you. So number one, v plus 6 and v minus 3 is equal to 0. That looks different than what we did before spring break because it's equal to 0. Before spring break, there was no equal sign. We were just factoring and getting something that looked like this left-hand side. Now, since I know that v plus 6 times v minus 3 equals 0, I can use that zero product property. And that says, since I'm multiplying these two things together to get 0, one or both have to be 0. So then I can set each factor equal to 0. So number one's nice because it's already factored for us. So we're going to take v plus 6, the first factor, and set that equal to 0. And we're going to take v minus 3, the second factor, and set that equal to 0. And those should look like equations you can solve relatively easily. So if we subtract 6 from both sides here, we get v is negative 6. If we add 3 to both sides here, we get v is equal to 3. So you should have two solutions. And that says if v is negative 6, this entire thing will equal 0, which makes sense because negative 6 plus 6 is 0. And it says that if v is 3, this entire thing is 0 because 3 minus 3 is 0. So this is your goal as we're going forward, is you're going to take something that's not factored and factor it so that you can set each one equal to 0. So obviously, as usual, the problems will get more challenging. So let's look at number 2. Number 2 is not factored for us, so we have to factor it, but this is not a trinomial. This is not a diamond problem. This is not a difference of squares because it's not a subtraction problem. So if you just watched the video on reviewing factoring methods, it's really none of those three things. So what did we learn about before we did those three methods? Well, we talked about greatest common factor. So if I look at 4n squared and 8n, both of those terms are divisible by 4, and they both have an n. So I'm going to take out their greatest common factor. So I'm going to have a 4n, and then what's left? Well, if I do 4n squared divided by 4n, I get n, and 8n divided by 4n is 2. So even though this looks a little bit different than number 1, it's still two things, 4n and n plus 2, that I'm multiplying together to get 0. So that means I can still use the zero product property. That says that if I'm multiplying these two things together to get 0, one or both of them has to be 0. So I can set each factor equal to 0. So 4n is equal to 0, or n plus 2 is equal to 0. Solving both of those equations should look like something you feel pretty comfortable doing. Here, if I divide both sides by 4, I get n is equal to 0. And here, if I subtract 2 from both sides, I get n is negative 2. So out of the kindness of my heart, I'm breaking today into 2 videos. So this one, again, reviewed zero product property, understanding what that is, and examples 1 and 2. The next video will have examples 3, 4, 5, and 6.